Okay, we are going to dive back into our sermon series, The Gospel According to ... We are going through the Old Testament to learn how to tell the story of Jesus the way Jesus did in the early church. So we've discovered that the story of Jesus didn't just happen. We talk about God doing something new, and to some degree that's true. But it's not just this brand new thing that came out of nowhere. It's actually what God has been up to since the beginning of time. And so when the church tells the story, they don't say, you see, this guy Jesus showed up and died for our sins so that we can believe in him and be our personal savior and go to heaven when we die. They say, you see, there was this guy named Abraham. There's this guy named Adam. There's this whole story that God has been writing that we're still actually living in and a part of. And so with that, we wanted to tell the gospel story the way that they did. And we have been looking through the Old Testament for these portraits, these sort of foreshadowings of Jesus. And have found that he's everywhere, right? And if you've been around church for a while, no doubt when you think of Jesus being everywhere in the Old Testament, you probably think of prophecy, right? All these prophetic moments where Isaiah or Jeremiah or Malachi or somebody else will point forward and say, this is what Jesus is going to do, or this is what he's going to be like. But we've discovered that it's not just those quote-unquote prophetic moments, but that Jesus is on every page. He didn't just say the prophets were talking about me. He goes so far, as we learned last week, to say the law is about me, which is pretty crazy to say, right? He says that all the writings are about me. He makes the Psalms about himself. He even makes the book of Genesis about himself. We saw how Adam and Eve points to Jesus, how Abraham points to Jesus, how Isaac points to Jesus, how Hagar points to Jesus. Over and over and over again, the whole thing is about him. That said, there are prophecies in the Old Testament as well that are all about Jesus. And today we're going to talk about one out of the book of Isaiah, actually several out of the book of Isaiah. So today's sermon will be called The Gospel According to Isaiah, or if you're from across the pond, Isaiah. But we're going to go with Isaiah because it just sounds weird for me to even say that out loud. But before we talk about Isaiah, I got to give you a little context about this guy named David. And if you're wondering why we're talking about David in the context of Isaiah, you'll find out in just a second, okay? So there was this guy named David. He was a king. First, he was a shepherd. This little guy, not much significance to anybody, not even his own family. But God said, I have selected David king. And he had David anointed king while there was still another king in place. Okay? A guy named Saul was already sitting on the throne, and God anointed David as king while Saul was still on the throne. Now, why is this? Well, it's because Saul was never God's first choice. Saul was the people's choice. He was the natural guy that we would all choose for king. He was tall and powerful and handsome and charismatic. There was an energy to him that people liked. And that's a problem. Because Saul liked that people liked him. And this eventually became his motivating factor as he did stuff because people liked it as opposed to because God liked it. And so God said, that was your choice. Now let me show you my choice. And he picks the last person anyone would expect. He anoints David king while Saul was king. When Saul eventually found out about this, you can imagine he wasn't too thrilled. That somebody else had been selected king while he was on the throne, and it wasn't his son. It was this shepherd boy, this nobody, who suddenly had a reputation. He slayed this giant named Goliath. He won battles on Saul's behalf, but instead of congratulating him, instead of promoting him, Saul tried to kill him over and over and over again. And David never retaliated. Despite having the opportunity, he never raised a hand against Saul. God called David a man after his own heart, which doesn't necessarily mean moral perfection. If you read on in the story, you know that David did some stuff. But man after God's own heart means that he oriented himself toward God in every season of life. It means that whatever he was holding in his hand, rather than just holding it or taking it to everybody else around him, he took it right to the throne of God. I've got worship, I've got praise, I've got joy, I've got excitement. Here it is, Lord. I've got sadness, I've got anxiety, I've got fear. Here it is, Lord. I've got sin, I've got guilt, I've got shame. Here, take this, Lord. That's what it means to be a man or a woman after God's own heart. Whatever you have in your hand, you take it there first, not somewhere else. And the result of this is profound. This man is a man of courage that would face down giants and armies. He's a man of victory. He experienced God move in his life in profound ways. He's a man of worship who loved the presence of God. As a matter of fact, he said, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 anywhere else. I'd rather be a gatekeeper in the house of my God than dwell among the tents of the wicked. I want to be where God is. He's a man of worship and prayer. And eventually he became king after Saul died. And here's the deal. He became king not through military coup, but by being patient and honorable and obedient. He waited for God to deliver instead of taking matters into his own hands. He honored the current king, though the current king was not honorable. He obeyed the word of God, even when obedience was difficult. And when the time came, God made him king. And David, sort of his first act as king was to wage war, right? Because that's what kings did, to consolidate territory. And one of the places he took a war was to this town that would become known as Jerusalem. And he conquered the city of Jerusalem. He made it his own city. To this day, you'll hear people refer to Jerusalem as the city of David. And he built himself a giant palace, and then he moved the Ark of the Covenant, which, if you remember from the story of the Exodus, is sort of this box that some people thought God lived in. God didn't live in the box, but it was a profound and a holy object that represented the presence of Yahweh among his people. And so David moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, built a palace for himself, put the Ark of the Covenant in this tabernacle, sort of a replica of the tent that they used in the wilderness. And then things get interesting. Because here David is sitting in this palace made of cedar and gold and all this sort of stuff. And I imagine he looks out his window and he sees this tent. It's a nice tent, but a tent nonetheless where the Ark of the Covenant lives. And David says to God, you know what? I want to build you a house too. It's not right for me to live in this palace while your box is living in a tent. So I'm going to build you, David says, a temple. The word in Hebrew is actually a house. I'm going to build you a house, God. And you know what God says to him? I'll tell you what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, thank you so much. I'm so honored. I've been waiting for somebody to say that. You know what he says? He says, I'm good with the tent. He says, tell you what, don't bother to build me a house. I want to make one thing clear. I never asked anybody for a house. He said, in fact, if you remember the story well, you all were slaves in Egypt. And then I delivered you from Egypt, and then you wandered in the wilderness. You were nomads going from place to place. You had no place of your own, and I secured a place for you. I chased out the armies that were in this land. I knocked down the walls of Jericho. I did all of this for you. In other words, he's saying, I never asked you for a house. I gave you a house. I gave you a home. I gave you a nation. I have done all this. And more than that, David, I gave you personally, not just your nation, I gave you this palace that you sit in. So be very, very careful not to think that you have done any of this. Not to think that it's by your strength or your power or your might that this has happened. It's all grace. And God says, as a matter of fact, here's how this is going to go down. I have given the nation of Israel a home. And now, David, you want to build me a house? I'll tell you what, I'm going to build you a house. Uses the same word but with a different meaning. David meant a temple. God meant a family. I'm going to build you a dynasty, a family. There will be one of your offspring who will always sit on the throne of Israel. This perpetual kingship. It's going to be for your family to rule over this nation. I'm going to give you a house. And he says, in fact, one of your offspring that'll come after you will build eventually a house for me. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And if you're familiar with the story, you think, oh, he's talking about Solomon, because Solomon, his son, comes along a little bit later and builds a temple for God and all this sort of stuff. But I'm not so sure he's talking about Solomon, or he is and he isn't. He says, I'll establish his throne forever. He will build a house for my name. All right, so what's going on here? Here's the moral of the story. David's feeling pretty powerful at this moment. He's sitting in this palace that he's had built for himself. I mean, listen, if you're living in a palace, you start to think highly of yourself whether you want to or not. And he starts to think pretty highly of himself, and he starts to feel pretty generous. God, I'm going to do some big grand gesture to show you how faithful I am, to show you how much I love you. And God is not even a little bit interested, because this is not how the covenant works. If David makes this grand gesture and builds a house for God, what are people going to say? Look how great David is. You know, as a matter of fact, when Solomon would eventually build the temple, up until that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians several hundred years later, you know what they called it? Solomon's temple. Not Yahweh's temple, Solomon's temple. When Herod the Great rebuilt it at the time of Jesus, what did they call it? Herod's temple. Look, God didn't want it to be called David's temple. God is not interested in grand gestures from great people. God is not a God for the put together or those who have it all and can do great things for him. Let me say that again. God is not a God for the put together or for the people who can do great things for him. If he was, David would never be there in the first place. David was the smallest guy in his family. David was the one, when Samuel says, line up all your sons, one of them is going to be king, his dad didn't even bother to call him in from the fields. Can't possibly be him. David was only there as an act of grace, and here's the thing. Suddenly he thinks it's about what he can do for God. Suddenly he thinks it's about this grand gesture, this great move. And God says essentially this: it was grace that got you here, and it's going to be grace that'll get you home. Don't we do that sometimes? We make these grand gestures to God. I'm going to stop doing this thing. I'm going to start doing this thing. And when I start doing this, God's going to love me. Won't you be so proud of me? It's all about my actions. It's all about my movements toward God. And all along, God is saying the only reason that you have any capacity to even think about that is because of my grace. You think you've been looking for me? I have been with you every step of your life. Before you even knew to make a grand gesture, before you had any idea who I was there. The fact that you exist at all is because I think of you. I have been drawing you to myself with cords of love. It is grace that got you here, and grace will get you home. Sometimes we think that this is all because of our goodness. It's not how the covenant works. Sometimes we come in broken, and we find profound healing in the presence of God. But then eventually we forget how broken we are, how broken we were. And we start to think that, okay, I'm good now. And it suddenly shifts from me being this needy person in the presence of God to me being somebody who now kind of gives to other people. And now I become the point. I become the one who has it all put together. When at the end of the day, the grace that I needed then when I came in broken, I still need today just as much. You know, it's like you come into a hospital broken and you get healed in there, and pretty soon you start thinking you're a doctor instead of just a patient telling somebody else who the good doctor is. That's what this is all about. But God still responds with grace. He doesn't beat David up for all of this. He says, tell you what, you want to build me a house? I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to cover this. One of your offspring is always going to sit on the throne, and it's going to be through your offspring, through your family line, which this is how you bless people in the ancient world. You ensure that somebody always remembers their name. It's a big deal in this kind of a culture. And it's going to be through this family then that the covenant is going to come, and Israel will be blessed, and the nations of the earth will be blessed, and ultimately the earth will be restored. But God has a provision in this blessing with David. I'm not reading the whole thing because it's long, but he basically says, and I know they're going to mess it up along the way. And when they mess it up, there will be consequences. As a matter of fact, God says, by the swords or the rods of men, they will be punished. In other words, some of your offspring are not going to get this right, and they will bear the consequences that will come from people, armies, nations. But even then, the covenant is not jeopardized. Even then, the promise is not obliterated, even by their disobedience, because one thing we've learned in this sermon series is what? God guarantees both halves of the covenant himself. I'm going to cover this one way or another. Eventually, there will be one of your offspring who will sit on the throne forever, and he will build a house for my name. Okay, that's the context. You ready? Along comes this guy named Isaiah. And Isaiah comes, oh, little guy. I'm sorry, was it something I said? Isaiah comes sort of, there's a lot of backstory here, but basically Isaiah comes at the end of a long string of bad decisions. Bad decisions, bad rulers, offspring of David who got it all wrong. Time and time and time again, generation after generation, for hundreds of years. And the consequences are, as Isaiah will tell us, among other things, 2 upcoming exiles. Okay, in other words, first, the Assyrian army was going to sweep in about 20 years from when Isaiah started his ministry, was going to sweep in from the east and take out the northern kingdom of Israel. And by the way, take out means kill everybody and haul the rest of them off into captivity. So this is violent, awful stuff that would happen. The Assyrians would come in, take everybody into captivity, and that city and that nation would never recover. Then a while later, from the east again, the Babylonians would sweep in and take the southern kingdom as well. Besiege the city of Jerusalem, destroy the city ultimately, destroy the temple of God, Solomon's temple, and take everybody who lived there into exile in Babylon. This is coming, and Isaiah is warning us about it. In other words, he's saying, this promise to David, you have not lived up to the terms. And as a consequence, the punishment I warned you about is coming. By the rods of men, you'll be punished. You'll face the consequences. But Isaiah says this. Remember, God guaranteeing both houses of the covenant himself. Isaiah says this in Isaiah chapter 11. You ready? But a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Anybody remember who Jesse is? David's dad. Okay? A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. And from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. A spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and might, a spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. And with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together. The lion will eat the straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's nest. The young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as water covers the seas. You notice this? I'm just going to point out some things to notice about this prophecy, okay? First thing he says, a shoot from the stump of Jesse. That's a vivid image, isn't it? What Isaiah is saying here is all of you, descendants of David, in other words, descendants of Jesse, David's father, have messed this up so badly that God has allowed foreign armies to come in and chop you down like a tree. Have you seen a stump in the wilderness? Dead. There is no life in this thing. There's a stump where there used to be this great tree. But it's not over, because how many of you walked through the woods and seen sometimes that a stump will have a new shoot popping out of the top of it? Have you seen that? That's the image. It's really vivid here. He's saying out of the stump of Jesse, a branch will come. And it'll start to bear fruit, new life out of the old dead thing. And it says the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. Now, who in the Old Testament has the Spirit of the Lord rest on them? His anointed ones. The Spirit of the Lord. Even on Saul, even though he was a bad dude, the Spirit of God rested on him. The Spirit of God was on David. Whenever God calls somebody, he will often anoint them with oil and with his Spirit. Okay, he says the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, and he will bring about justice. I'm going to pause here for just a second. Embedded into the heart of the gospel story is justice for the oppressed. This is at the very core of what it means to be the people of God. And I want to stop here because the last few years in the American church have gotten weird, haven't they? Where I've heard people, Christians, telling other Christians that we can't use words like social justice. That those are now part of the liberal agenda. And it bothers me deeply because it's in our book. The word human rights, do you guys know this? Comes from the King James translation of the Bible. The word translated here, justice, King James translated as rights. In other words, he will bring about rights for the poor and the oppressed. If you read the gospel story very carefully, if you read the prophets, if you read the writings, you'll find out that the reason all of this happened, the reason that these two armies swept in and cut down the tree of Judah and Israel, the reason it happened was not just that they worshiped foreign gods, but because they worshiped foreign gods and took their eyes off of Yahweh, they failed also to care for the people around them. They failed to care for the most vulnerable people in their society, and so the prophets call them out not just for their sin of idolatry, but for their sin of injustice. These are the only two sins in the Old Testament where God says, if you participate in these things, I will walk away. I will turn my back on you for a season. Idolatry and injustice. And so when this anointed one, this shoot from the stump of Jesse, this one that the Spirit of the Lord rests on, when he shows up, he doesn't just bring about the salvation of souls. He brings about a new social system, justice for everyone. And it goes on to say, and he will slay, or he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. And if you've been around the American Christian church for a while, we get excited about God slaying the wicked, don't we? We get excited because we have this kind of this angst to us that one day somebody's going to show up and judge all of this stuff. God is going to strike the earth, it says, and we get excited. We get excited about this, no more of this sort of passive Jesus showing up. When Jesus shows up next time, he shows up as a warrior, like in Revelation 19. You remember that vision of him? He shows up riding on a horse, and he's got a tattoo. Did you know that Jesus has a tattoo on his leg that says King of Kings? And he's got a sword coming out of his mouth with which he strikes the earth, and we say, yes, finally, warrior Jesus, ripped, yoked Jesus, come to take on the world. And we Americans, we get excited about this, but we miss the fact that the sword isn't in his hand, it's in his mouth. We miss the fact that here, when he strikes the earth, he does so with the rod of his mouth. In other words, with his words. When Jesus shows up to judge the earth, to bring conviction, he doesn't do it with a sword in his hand to kill people. He does it with the words of his mouth that penetrate to the heart and cause conviction and cause change. This is a big deal. You see, friends, Jesus isn't schizophrenic. There's not two different Jesuses. Sometimes we read the Gospels and we see this gentle and humble Jesus who dies for our sins and doesn't speak back when people are hitting him in the face. He just takes it, and then we see Revelation 19 and we're like, oh, he changed. He got really mad. That whole thing really upset him. That the trauma of the cross caused Jesus' personality to change, and when he comes back, he's going to be really angry. No. The guy who spoke the Sermon on the Mount about loving our enemies, he still means that. He didn't change his mind about those words. And when he shows up again with the sword coming out of his mouth, it's to bring conviction, not death. It's life. Look, here's the thing. The judgment that Jesus brings into our lives is life. It's not death. He doesn't judge to condemn, but to save. He said, don't think I've come to condemn the world, but to save it. He brings conviction with the words of his mouth. He brings life through judgment. And then, in the most vivid picture in the whole Bible, he restores creation. It's this Garden of Eden language. Any really visual people start to picture that scene in your mind? Of the lion and the lamb laying down together? The bear playing around with the cows? A little child walking through with a procession of predators following behind him? Like a toddler. Get this picture. This is a terrifying picture, but it's intended to be really disruptive. A toddler sticking his hand into a viper's nest and pulling out a viper and saying, "Hey, viper." Because that's the picture. It's really vivid. And he's saying he's going to restore the whole earth. Death and fear and everything that goes along with it will go away. Why? Because on that day, everyone will know God. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of God. And when the earth is full of the knowledge of God, sin and death no longer make sense. And this is the way it's supposed to be. We are made in the image of God to know God and to share God with the whole world. And he says that's how it's going to happen. going to happen through this root, this shoot out of the stump of Jesse. But how? Okay? That's the question I'm still left with. Okay, so somebody's going to show up, and in some way that we don't quite understand, he's going to bring about justice for the whole world. He's going to bring about a restoration of Eden, but how is he going to pull it off? Because see, something we've learned in this series is that oftentimes we think of the justice and mercy of God in tension with one another. That God has basically two choices, right? Either he can judge the earth because there's all sorts of stuff that needs to be judged. Everybody, we're good on this one? There's all kinds of stuff out there that if God just lets it happen, we call this enabling. God is not an enabler, so he has to be just. But on the other hand, we also recognize that if he does judge everything that deserves to be judged, then that means that this place probably should be empty right now. You know, at least I shouldn't be up here. That's for certain. I mean, you guys might be good, but... So there's this tension between the justice and mercy of God, and this passage doesn't resolve that for us. It just says somebody's going to show up who's going to fix it. How is he going to fix it? Well, glad you asked. There's another prophecy in Isaiah, this one in Isaiah 42. Listen to this. This is out of a section of Isaiah called the Servant Songs. It says, "Here's my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on earth. In his teachings, the islands will put their hope. This is what the Lord says, the creator of heavens, who stretches them out, who spread out the earth and with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind and to free the captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness." Another beautiful prophecy about the same guy. This time he's called the servant of the Lord. No longer the stump, the shoot from the stump of Jesse, the branch, but the servant of the Lord. And what we need to notice here is there's some similarities. He's going to bring about justice. He's going to bring about a light for the nations. He's going to strike the earth and slay the wicked and establish justice and restore Eden and fill the earth with the knowledge of God. But notice, there's something about him that's somewhat unexpected. Because it says he'll be quiet. Did you guys notice that? He's not going to shout out in the streets. No crying out, no making his voice heard obvious. I have a question for you. How does he strike the earth with the rod of his mouth without raising his voice? He is going to slay the nations with his words without ever raising his voice. My friends, if there's something American Christians need to learn from Jesus, it's this. We will not change the earth by the volume of our voices. Jesus shows up on the scene and he's quiet. But he lives a life of integrity that's in alignment with his words, so when he speaks, even with just a whisper, those words penetrate. See, our problem today, I think, is that we don't live the life of integrity so that our words are in alignment with our actions. So when we speak, no one believes us. So we talk louder to convince them that we really mean it. We post on Facebook. We get as loud and as big as we can possibly be. And here it says Jesus was quiet. He was gentle. Did you notice that? It says, a bruised reed he will not break. Again, the imagery here is so beautiful. It's Jesus walking through a field so gently that he's not even crushing the grass he's walking on. That when he passes by a branch that's bent over, he doesn't snap it off with his body as he moves by. It's like you almost didn't even know he was there. That's how soft his footprint on the earth is. What I mean by that is he didn't draw attention to himself or seek power. He didn't run for office or lead an army. He didn't kill anybody or conquer or torture or oppress. He never swung a sword. And yet he will bring justice to the earth in his way. Gently, quietly. He walks past so softly that a candle that's about to go out doesn't even go out with the wind of his passing. Man, a couple years ago, I heard a pastor being interviewed on TV about presidential election and what he's looking for in a president. He described all this sort of stuff. And the interviewer, who was not a Christian, said, what about like the Sermon on the Mount and the words of Jesus? Like, do you want a president who embodies the life of Jesus? And a pastor, well-known pastor, said, not at all. He said, that's great for church. When it comes to ruling the nations, you need an iron fist. And I was floored because that's what many of us think. Like, we wouldn't say it out loud in those terms, but that's what we think. We think that the way of Jesus is great for church and it's great for interpersonal relationships. But when it comes to governments, when it comes to nations, we need somebody who's strong and loud and forceful. But here, we see that he will bring justice to the nations in his way. Has loud or forceful torture or conquest, has it ever actually worked in the history of the world? Why do we think it's going to work this time? He managed to overthrow the Roman Empire without ever swinging a sword. This passage, friends, should cause us to rethink just about everything about the way we think about and pursue power. From our relationships with one another on a social level, our marriages, our friendships, our employers, employees, all the way up to government, to the top levels of government. If we embrace the way of Jesus, everything changes. It says the islands will put their hope in his teachings. I love that. Don't you love that picture? That just means, what that means is the farthest away you can possibly get. And that's happened, hasn't it? Without ever swinging a sword, without ever leading an army, without ever holding public office, the islands have put their hope in his teachings. You can go to Vanuatu right now and find followers of Jesus. Papua New Guinea, Micronesia. I mean, pick an island somewhere, and they will have heard of this rabbi who never left 30 miles from his hometown, who never shouted out in the streets, who never killed or tortured anybody. They have put their hope in his teachings. And God says, I will make him a covenant for the people of Israel and a light to the nations. Do you hear that? I will make him a covenant. It doesn't say he will fulfill the covenant. It says he will be the covenant. What does that mean? He will be the covenant. That leads us to our next text in Isaiah. Who has believed our message? This is Isaiah 53. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by humankind. A man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him stricken, punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity or the sin of us all. How is he the covenant? By suffering. This is where things get crazy, right? Because God said, when you fail this covenant, there will be consequences. And we know that. The justice of God demands that when we fall short of the glory of God, there is consequence. Sin breaks the world. It breaks us. It's the way it's designed. It's when you try to use a machine in a way that it wasn't intended, it breaks. That's what sin does. There are consequences to those actions. And God, because he's good, can't just enable, he can't just erase those consequences and pretend like they don't exist. It doesn't work that way. So what does he choose to do instead? To suffer himself the pain of the consequence. See it? He chooses to forgive, because that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is choosing to suffer on behalf of the person who hurt you so they don't have to suffer. And that's what God does. He steps in and says, I will be, if you were here a few weeks ago, the bull torn in half. Not because of my disobedience, but because of yours. He says, I will be the sacrifice. He is the true and better Isaac. He is the one who steps in when we fail. And that's what it means, I will be the covenant. If it says I will fulfill the covenant, it just means I'll fulfill my part. It means I'll do my duty. I'll be faithful to you. But when he says I will be the covenant, he's saying he will guarantee the whole thing himself. I'll do my duty, and when you don't, I will bear the consequence. By his stripes we're healed. You see, he comes and he suffers, and it's through suffering that he brings forgiveness and healing. It's through suffering that he brings about this resolution to the justice and mercy problem. By being the justice of God and being mercy to all of us. He combines them all in himself. But that leaves us with one last problem and one last text in Isaiah. The problem is this. We were not promised simply that he would forgive us of our sins, but that he would give us victory. See, forgiveness is basically a reset to zero. And that's where so many Christians live, like in this cycle of failure and forgiveness, constantly reset to zero. But that's not the image we got in Isaiah 11, isn't it? We got new creation. We got lion and lamb, like crazy, world-changing, like the whole world is made new. Fear is gone, death is gone, sin is gone, and he wants to give us that. But how can he do that if he's gone? If he's dead? As a matter of fact, if we read Isaiah chapter 9, the famous Christmas text, it says, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And get this, the government will be upon his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the greatness and increase of his government there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. I want to be clear on this. Jesus' mission was never simply to deliver us from the consequences of our actions so that we can experience everything we ever wanted. That's what I call the personal Savior Jesus. I got myself into a hole, and he got me out of it, and now he set me free to live the life of my dreams. Okay? It's not what he's about. He's about a lot more than that. Notice what we're not getting here is a champion. We're not getting a champion who fights a battle for us and dies on our behalf. We're getting a king who leads us himself. The government rests on his shoulders, who is doing something new on the earth through his presence, who is Wonderful Counselor. How can we have a wonderful counselor if he's dead and buried and in the ground? Not going to get a lot of advice from that counselor, are we? But no, he's Mighty God. He's the Everlasting Father. He's the Prince of Peace. He doesn't promise us simply deliverance from our sins. He promises us deliverance to himself. He gives us a person, and how can he do that? If he's gone, if he's buried, if he's this man of sorrow, this man of affliction. I guess what I'm wrestling with is, how can this anointed one, if anointed means blessed by God, also be one who is considered to be cursed by God? How can those two come together? And that's what Easter Sunday is all about. You see, the resurrection is how it all snaps into place. How can the conquering king of Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah chapter 9 also be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53? It's because suffering wasn't the end. It's because the cross wasn't a defeat, but a victory. It's because he didn't stay dead. God raised him from the dead. He vindicated Jesus. He showed that that moment, as dark as it was a gateway, a doorway into a new world. And when he stands alive now, the world itself is remade. And he draws us to himself. He says, if I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. He draws us to himself, to a relationship through which we are set free and remade and invited into a whole new creation. And the resurrection ties it all together. See, this chunk of passages for thousands of years, and even to this day, people have no idea what to do with Isaiah because it's all over the map. Is this multiple people he's talking about? This conquering king, oh, I like that. This suffering servant, that's super disturbing. And it wasn't until Jesus rose from the dead that people started to realize it's the same guy. We see that in the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus on Easter Sunday. They're walking along a road, wrestling with the fact that the one they thought that was the Messiah, the anointed one, was hung on a cross and crucified. And Jesus showed up and he walked beside him. And what did he do? He spent the entire walk taking them through the scriptures and showing them everything it said about himself, that he had to suffer and he had to die and he rose again. And then he showed them himself risen, and suddenly it clicked on. It's like the Ethiopian eunuch when he's riding back from Jerusalem. He's riding back to Ethiopia, reading Isaiah 53. And Philip comes up alongside him and says, what you reading? And he says, I'm reading this thing, but it's confusing because I don't know who this guy's talking about. Is he talking about himself or someone else? And Philip says, let me tell you. He walks him through the whole story, shows him the suffering servant is the conquering Messiah. He shows him that makes sense when Jesus is risen from the dead. And click, the Ethiopian eunuch realizes, is there anything that can prevent me from being baptized in his name right now? Reminds me of Paul. Paul who's persecuting Jesus. Paul who was 100% convinced that Jesus could not be the Messiah. Why? Because Messiah means anointed, and anointed means blessed. And the Bible is clear. Anyone who hangs on a tree is not blessed, but cursed. And so Paul thinks Christians are insane. How can you possibly think that a Messiah was crucified? That's the opposite of what Messiah literally means. And then one day, Paul's on the road to Damascus. This vision of Jesus risen from the dead knocks him on his back, blinds him, and in this moment he spends the next 3 days blind and in bed. And what do you think was happening in the mind of this man who was so brilliant, who had been studying Torah his entire life? I mean, he probably had, I'm not even exaggerating, he probably had the entire Old Testament committed to memory in Hebrew and Greek. And for 3 days, 72 hours, he sat with nothing to do. And I imagine in his mind, he was just going through the entire thing from Adam to Abraham to Moses to Isaiah, through the prophets, through all of them. And I just imagine his mind was just exploding over and over and over again, where he realized it was him all along. The resurrection proves it. The resurrection makes sense of all of the broken fragments of our story. They make sense in him. He draws all the pieces together, and he is that last piece that when it fits in, the picture is unveiled. And Paul's mind is just blown to realize that the conquering Messiah and the suffering servant are the same guy. It reminds me of us coming in here today with all the broken pieces of our lives, wondering, what is God up to? Where was he when this happened? How could he allow these kind of things to happen in my life? Why isn't he answering these prayers? Why isn't he answering my questions? Where have you been in my story? And then we're handed this story, this Jesus, who promises to make it all right. Not just to wipe it away, but to redeem it and to renew it, who promises freedom and new life, and guarantees it himself, who steps in, is not aloof from our story, but steps into it and takes on our suffering. He doesn't yell, he doesn't shame, he comes in gently and speaks truth that pierces our hearts, gets past our defenses, strikes at the core of our being. He wounds to heal. And then he puts his money where his mouth is. He steps in and takes the consequence, takes the punishment, takes all of it for us. And we hear this story, and my friends, your heart starts to beat a little bit faster. And suddenly you don't know why, but your eyes are getting a little bit misty. And you realize that that's the key. That all along, I've been holding these broken pieces, trying to mash them together, trying to see how they fit, how it all works, how every moment of my life is going to go, and how it has gone, and why. We ask why incessantly and endlessly, and God never gives us the answer we're looking for. He just gives us a person. And when we see him as he is, all the broken pieces start to orbit around him. And they start to fit together in a way that we would have never imagined. We would have never done ourselves. But they make sense in him. Would you pray with me? Jesus, would you let it be? I'm under no illusion that any word that I give today can do anything. But if it's all true, if you are alive and by your Spirit are here with us and drawing us to yourself, then in this room today, anything's possible. That anyone who walks in with broken pieces or cuts from the jagged edges or big questions, if we have people who are walking in here with that big why question that's just been tearing at your soul, God says, how about you just take a look at my son? How about you just get close to my Jesus? Walk with him. Let him in. Let him in. I just get this picture of this like crazy messy house, you know? Like you've had just the craziest week of all time and you just haven't had the energy to do anything. Wash the dishes, sweep the floors, do anything that you would want to do if you're going to have somebody over. And Jesus knocks on the door and you're just telling him like, hold on, let me clean it up first. You know, you literally got Jesus standing at the door knocking, and you're just saying, let me get these things in order first. And he's just saying, open the door. Like, let him come into the mess. That's why he came. He didn't come for those who think they have it all together. He came for those who know they need help. So let him into the mess. And see what he does with it. See what he does with the broken pieces. See what he does with the chaos, with the doubts and the fears. See what he does with the whys. God is not giving you an answer. He's giving you a person. He's giving you himself. So if that's you today, and you're just holding broken pieces, you're holding questions, you're holding coping mechanisms, ways of dealing with life, would you just let him in and see what he does with all of it?